So a quick introduction to the Climate Investment Fund. So those of us who've joined who are maybe not aware, or this might be their first CIF webinar that they're attending. The CIF was established in 2008 and is a climate fund with over USD 11 billion climate fund. It's one of the first and the largest multilateral climate funds globally. It's also the largest source of concessional finance for multilateral development banks, which include the World Bank and IFC, and for regional development banks. It provides a platform in which multilateral development banks can come together to accelerate the impact from their investments and fund underfunded sectors for transformational outcomes. There are several areas in which CIF operates. There's a list on the slide here, but it includes clean technologies, energy access, adaptation, forestry, coal transition, nature-based solutions, renewable energy integration, and industrial decarbonization. Next slide, please. Just to share with you what were the main evaluation objectives or the motivation for doing an evaluation of development impacts from climate finance. We've seen in the climate sector that oftentimes climate action and development are pitted against each other, making it seem like taking action in one area would necessarily come at the cost of the other. We know at the CIF that this need not be so. We had early evidence from CIF's work and from the work of our partner MDBs that climate and development are actually profoundly linked, which means not just that climate impacts are a threat to development because climate impacts can push millions into poverty, but also that taking proactive steps to lessen and manage climate impacts could lead to positive development outcomes. At the World Bank, for example, climate action is seen as fundamental to alleviating poverty and boosting shared prosperity in a sustainable way. So we wanted to learn how we can do this better, starting with an understanding of what are the potential development impacts from climate finance, and then to estimate, and then to understand how we can estimate these impacts and how do we proactively plan and achieve them. So in short, the evaluation objectives were to expand the knowledge and evidence base on development impacts, to strengthen the case for increased volumes of climate finance, and to enable decision makers to make more informed decisions. Next slide, please. So these are the key objectives for the evaluation. I already sort of summarized the intention of them, but we were looking at what are the potential impacts, how are these being achieved, what are the drivers and constraints, and how can these be strengthened and assessed. Next slide, please. The speakers for today, I've already introduced myself, but we also have Nicole Pasricha, who is the moderator for the conversation today, also the head of impact and climate change at Alma Sustainable Finance. She's also a senior consultant with the Climate Investment Funds and was responsible for CIF's early modeling efforts related to development impacts. We have Daniel Kaufman, who is principal at Industrial Economics and was the team lead or leading the independent evaluation teams to conduct this evaluation. We have Debashish Paul Shuvra, who is the disaster risk management at the World Bank and was closely involved in the projects in Bangladesh that this evaluation looked at. We have Clarice Cruz, who's the environmental analyst in the Brazil Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and also the government focal point for CIF's forestry projects in Brazil. We have Helena Lawira, who is the senior project officer at Asian Development Bank. She's been working very closely with the government in Indonesia on climate mitigation and adaptation projects. And we have Brittany Malloy, who's analyst with the CIF and also part of the independent evaluation team that helped conduct this evaluation from the Climate Investment Fund side. Next, before we hand over to Daniel Kaufman to take us through the findings from the evaluation, we just wanted to ask very quickly through a Zoom poll just to get the audience warmed up a little bit. Brittany, you can take this slide down and just ask you very quickly your quick thoughts on whether you think climate and development are closely linked. So do you agree with this statement? Do you disagree with it? Or do you think it depends? So if you could just take a minute to answer this quick poll. Brittany, I'm not sure. Can you see how many responses we've got? Should we give it a couple more seconds?
Yeah, we have 81% participation so far. So almost everyone.
I'd say 81 is a pretty high percentage for a survey response. So let's go ahead and see the response, see the results here. All right, so we have most of the self-selected participants here thinking that they agreed that there's a close link between development and climate action. We have a minority that disagrees, and then we have a significant number of people who are saying it depends. So I'm going to hand to Daniel to give us an answer to that question from the portfolio that you looked at the climate investment funds. Daniel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Neha, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Kaufman. I'm a principal with Industrial Economics, or IEC, and as Neha said, I was the consulting team lead for this independent evaluation of the development impacts of climate finance at the SIF. In addition to IEC, we had very valuable contributions from our teaming partners, Trinomics, BV, Ross Strategic, and a number of individual consultants who also made significant contributions to the study. So as Neha mentioned, our evaluation addressed four key learning questions. And Brittany, you can go to the next slide, please. And the four key learning questions relate to the potential development impacts of climate finance, DI results, drivers and constraints to achieving development impacts, and how development impacts can be strengthened and assessed. So we came to this project with the awareness that climate action and development are closely linked, and that development impacts can be a core benefit of climate finance, an opinion that seems to be held by a majority of respondents. But we also came to the study with a hypothesis that if we can articulate and assess these linkages better, we can actually make a stronger case for climate finance and achieve even stronger development impacts from climate finance projects and investments. So for everyone who said it depends, the link between climate finance and development impacts depends, we were trying to figure out what does it depend on and how can we maximize those linkages. Next slide, please. So the evaluation combines quantitative and qualitative methods into three levels of evaluative activities. We conducted a secondary information review of existing reports, evaluations, and other studies that included projects funded by the SIF, as well as projects that were not funded by the SIF. And the main purpose of the secondary information review was to identify potential development impacts and how they can be achieved through climate finance investments. We also conducted 13 original case studies to understand development impact results that have actually been achieved, as well as the drivers and constraints to achieving those results. And through the case studies, we also tested modeling approaches that can be used to estimate some of the hard to estimate development impacts. We also tested potential modeling tools and applied them at the SIF portfolio level to understand achieved development impacts in priority areas. So moving to the next slide, this provides a high-level overview of the 13 case studies that we conducted. We conducted a combination of deep dive case studies that included new modeling and primary research, as well as a series of light touch case studies that were mostly based on the secondary information review and interviews. The case studies represent a mix of regions, SIF programs, MDB partners, sectors, and DI coverage. And a key thing to note from this slide is that throughout the evaluation, we identified and looked at a few major categories of development impacts. These include social, economic, environmental, and market developments. We also identified very important development impacts relating to capacity development and inclusion, including gender-related impacts. And we call these cross-cutting impacts because they show up in the other four development impacts categories. And the colors and shading in the table shows which impacts categories we addressed in each case study. And I'll be giving some examples as we go along. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk through three of the key insights from the report. I really encourage everyone to take a look at the report and the summary document that were recently posted on SIF's website. There's a lot more information contained in those documents, but for the sake of time, I'll only be speaking to a subset today. So first, the evaluation does find an extremely tight link between climate investment and development impacts. We found this in all areas of the evaluation. This includes very tight links to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. For example, in the social development impacts category, one of the main development impacts is access to essential services. And we found that access to essential services is related to indicators in 7 of the different Sustainable Development Goals. Another major social development impact is increased capacity of local institutions. And this relates to indicators in 11 different SDGs, while the other social development impacts correspond to at least one sustainable development impact each, or sustainable development goal each. And the report shows the full mapping of development impacts to the sustainable development goals. So clearly looked at in a variety of ways, there are tight linkages between development impacts and climate finance. The main intention of the study, though, was to understand how to make these links stronger. And that's what our key insights focus on. So moving to the next slide. The first insight that I'll be talking through is this, that a systematic approach to classifying and mapping development impacts can help to better understand, plan for, and achieve development impacts. As part of the study, and based on the secondary information review that we conducted, we developed a new climate finance development impact taxonomy and impact pathways, which are intended to provide a useful foundation to help stakeholders articulate their development impact objectives and to map these objectives to their projects and investments. So this shows a quick overview of the development impact taxonomy. It corresponds to the major development impacts categories in the case studies that you might recall from a couple slides back: social, economic, environmental, market development, and cross-cutting. And this is a lot to read, so I hope no one will actually try to read everything on the slide here. This information is all in the reports. But a couple of key takeaways here. First are within each general category of development impacts, we identified a number of subcategories of development impacts. And within those subcategories, we identified a total of 60 possible development impacts based on the secondary information review. Next slide, please. So in addition to classifying the different types of development impacts, we also developed development impact pathways. And this slide provides one example of a development impact pathway. The development impact pathways show how climate finance interventions can lead to development impacts. And this impact pathway is from the case study that we developed for the Thailand's wind case study. So here we look at the utility scale wind project. That was what the case study focused on. And then we look at the development impacts that results over time from these investments and from these projects. We also look at this in the context of development impact drivers, which are indicated by the green upward pointing arrows, and barriers, as indicated by the red downward arrows, which affect the development impact pathways. So I'll be speaking about one example now. If you look along the impact pathway, community engagement policies, that's the green arrow at the bottom of the slide. Community engagement policies directly influence the achievement of community engagements. They also directly influence resulting development impacts, such as the acquisition of transferable job skills and capacity building. And I saw a question about which were the catalytic development impacts. I'll be talking more about that, but this is one example here of how community engagement and social inclusion not only benefited the population around the projects that was engaged and included, but also made other development impacts possible, such as transferable job skills, capacity developments, local workforce developments, and increased community benefits. So if we move to the next slide, we can think about how we might use this to design projects for development impacts. In the case study that we looked at, we were looking at an example where the community engagement strategy was planned for upfront. And when we looked back at the project and conducted the evaluation, we saw the benefits that resulted from this inclusive strategy. But this wasn't guaranteed. We can imagine a hypothetical example where the same wind turbines were installed, but they would not have provided the same benefits to the local communities, absent the community engagement strategy. You still would have had the air quality benefits and the renewable power generation that results from utility scale winds, but the community engagement benefits and all of the development impacts that resulted from the community engagement benefits, which are shown in the red box at the bottom of the slide, would not necessarily have resulted without that intentional focus upfront on community engagement. So then the question becomes, how can we better plan for development impacts upfront? And one way is to apply the development impact taxonomy and the impact pathways when we design projects. One way to do this is to take what we call a backcasting approach. Backcasting starts with the end in mind. We ask, what development impacts do we want to achieve with this project or investment? Backcasting can enable the SIF and other climate funders to plan for more relevant development impacts and to shape how projects are designed, implemented, monitored, and evaluated. Climate funders can achieve better results if they identify the most important development impacts through diagnostic work and investment planning, and then design the projects to achieve those goals. Next slide, please. So within the general category of development impacts, we identified a set of development impacts which are particularly catalytic, and we refer to these development impacts as SuperDIs. We call them SuperDIs because they're catalysts to unlock other development impacts. As shown on the left-hand side of the slide, SuperDIs that we identified include social and gender inclusion, capacity development, local workforce development, and market development. And some of the other development impacts that are unlocked or enabled by the SuperDIs include job creation, increased earnings, improved livelihoods, and a variety of education, health, and environmental benefits. We found cross-cutting development impacts, including the SuperDIs of capacity building and gender inclusion in 8 out of our 13 case studies. And in many of the case studies, we weren't necessarily looking to find this or expecting this up front, but these SuperDIs emerged through the case study analysis as being really important drivers. Now, beyond the fact that these development impacts were strongly reflected in the evaluation, what was even more notable to us was how frequently they were actually a precursor or a prerequisite for other development impacts, such as increased earnings, job benefits, and improved livelihoods. And so these SuperDIs are particularly crucial to plan for in the project design stage. Next slide, please. So now I'll be talking through a few examples of SuperDIs from the case studies that we conducted. On the previous slide, I mentioned inclusion and community engagement. And these are both found to be important first-order development impacts, as well as key drivers that help to ensure social and economic development impacts, as well as the equitable distribution of those social and economic development impacts. Prioritizing vulnerable and marginalized groups, including women, can enhance development effectiveness, distribute the benefits more equitably, and increase the uptake and effectiveness of sustainable practices and technologies. So an example here was in the low-carbon agriculture project in Brazil's Cerrado biome. A previously conducted program evaluation found that farms that were headed by a woman, or where women were the main decision makers at the farms, were actually quicker to adopt the sustainable techniques compared to farms that were headed by men. And the quicker adoption of these sustainable farming techniques actually enhanced the delivery of the project's broader development impacts. And similarly, other case studies also show that project strategies that aim to improve the participation and empowerment of women and vulnerable populations lead to DIs such as increased earnings and improved quality of life. We also found that capacity-related activities and outcomes are key drivers for a variety of development impacts, including competitiveness, market development, employment, and earnings. In 10 of our 13 case studies, capacity constraints were identified as a key barrier that limited the achievement of development impacts. But we also found that technical assistance, training, and capacity building were actually able to help counteract these barriers to achieve development impacts, including local workforce developments, local supply chain developments, and increased and diversified income. An example here was in the India rooftop solar projects. We found in the India rooftop solar projects that 2 rooftop solar programs are estimated to have created over 8,500 direct jobs in construction and maintenance, as well as 900 indirect jobs in solar equipment manufacturing. And it's important to note that these job impacts are due in part to the focus on small-scale distributed solutions that really employed the local workforce and helped to develop the local workforce so that they could benefit from these solar projects. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to be walking through an example from a deep dive case study, and we'll be spending a few minutes talking through this example. And this is actually a perfect segue to address the question in the chat. Can you elaborate on how the development impacts and pathways relate to the theory of change or results chain? So conceptually, the idea is very similar here to a theory of change. We're starting with the end in mind, in this case, the end being the development impacts that we want to achieve. And then we're working backwards to identify the activities that need to be conducted to achieve those development impacts. The key difference, though, is that instead of looking at our standard logic model categories, activities, outputs, short-term, medium-term, long-term outcomes, we're really looking through a development impacts lens. So all along this chain, after the intervention, we're really looking at different development impacts. So we can think of first-order development impacts, such as SuperDIs, and then how do those development impacts unlock or lead to further development impacts, and ultimately to what we see as the ultimate development impacts goals. And this will become, I think, clearer through the example that I'm about to share. So this is an example from the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Project in Bangladesh. This provides an example of a development impacts pathway where we looked at investments in climate resilience infrastructure and then some of the development impacts that we expect to result from those investments. And on this slide, the dark blue are development impacts that we tried to quantify. The light blue are development impacts that we looked at qualitatively. And the gray are those that we were unable to fully assess due to data limitations or the time lag required to realize the benefit. So this impact diagram shows how investments in climate resilience infrastructure lead to first-order outcomes, and then the development benefits that can result from the first-order outcomes. So here we see that investments in climate-resilient coastal embankments and polder rehabilitation, the infrastructure investments, first of all, reduce flooding from sea level rise. The reduction in flooding from sea level rise protects farmland from extreme weather and saltwater intrusion, which can otherwise inundate and ruin the crops. The protection from extreme weather and saltwater intrusion results in improvements in cropping intensity and more diversified and profitable crops, which ultimately results in increased farmer income and economic benefits. Next slide, please. And so this slide summarizes the methods and results from the development impact evaluation case study. So first, we refined the development impact pathway from which we had initially developed from the secondary information review to reflect the specific context and details of the case study. We then identified select development impacts and pathways to focus on, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And we drew on a variety of data sources. The government maintained really rich information, including a baseline survey report and post-implementation focus groups with farmers, which were really invaluable for our case study. We also conducted original modeling analysis to look both at crop revenues as well as economic impacts. Next slide, please. So what did our modeling find? We found, first of all, that the polders do protect from storm surge and tidal flooding, and that incidents of storm surge and tidal flooding on the farmland have declined since the infrastructure was put in place. We also find a significant increase in cropping intensity, particularly during the Rabi season, which is one of the main growing seasons in Bangladesh. Our modeling analysis finds an increase of $56 million in revenues annually by the year 2032, as well as $50 million of economic value added annually and 25,000 jobs supported by the year 2032. Now, in addition to the modeling results, there were also a number of other exciting and somewhat unexpected development impacts. For example, increased mobility. So as shown with, it's shown in this photo of the children riding their bike on the polders don't just protect the farmlands from storm surge and flooding, they also can serve as roads, providing access to markets, schools, work, and healthcare. We also found a suggestion that there were improvements in food security. Since a high portion of household expenses in the area are used on food, an increase in farmer income or household income should result in greater food security. And we also identified important capacity building benefits, both for the local communities who participate in the water management associations that help monitor and maintain the polders, as well as improved government capacity. We found that the data collection and analytics that are developed by the project are greatly expanding the knowledge base of the area's natural systems, which are helping to inform land use and water resource planning. I see the questions about different types of funding instruments and how these affect different types of development impacts. In the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we defer that question later on for discussion and Q&A, but we'll definitely make a note of that and we can come back to it. And then just very quickly, moving to the next slide, I just want to touch on one other example of a case study that we conducted. This was for the Indonesia geothermal development projects. So again, we plotted out our development impact pathway based on the development impacts that can result from investments in large-scale renewable energy, in this case, large-scale geothermal. And what we aimed to model in this case study was economy-wide impacts from an increase in geothermal investments. Next slide, please. What we find, to summarize succinctly, is billions of dollars in increased economy-wide benefits. And this comes from increased economic activity and productivity, as well as education and human capital benefits that results from a more reliable supply of electricity, as well as a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which results from displacing fossil fuel powered energy with clean geothermal energy. And we can also talk more about this case study during the discussion and question and answer. Next slide, please. So I had mentioned in the beginning that in addition to the case study analysis, We also looked at different models that the SIF and other climate funders can use to estimate and assess development impacts from their investments. We conducted a comparative analysis of 14 different models, and we tested 4 of these models through the case studies. The key takeaway here is that these development impacts categories can actually be modeled. Although in many cases they have not been widely studied, they are common to the SIF portfolio. And we find that modeling tools and approaches currently exist that can actually be used to model these development impacts. And that was a really exciting finding from our evaluation. For those in our audience who are particularly interested in the modeling aspect of our study, I would encourage you to look at the modeling memo. The modeling memo is a companion work product that was released along with the evaluation report. It's also on the SIF's website. And in the modeling memo, we assess the tools and we rate them based on their level of complexity and the level of data required. And we talk about how we tested these tools through the case studies and the results that we found. And so we believe that this sets a strong foundation for future analysis of development impacts. Next slide, please. I wanted to note quickly that in addition to the way that we applied the models, which was primarily for ex post evaluation, we can also use modeling all along the project's life cycle. So ex ante modeling can be used when developing investment plans or designing projects. It can also be used, and the modeling results can be used to gain stakeholder buy-in and to attract funding. It can also be used to help decision makers prioritize and balance trade-offs across different development impacts. And then, of course, it can also be used for ex post evaluation. Next slide, please. So for my last slide, I want to provide a snapshot of some of the recommendations that we offer in the evaluation report. And again, this is a succinct, partial view of our recommendations. Overall, our recommendations are focused on stakeholders that want to carry forward with the development impacts work. And so a lot of the specifics of implementing these recommendations would be for project implementers, MDB partners, and others who are really involved with on-the-ground implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So the way that we frame our recommendations looks at different goals for maximizing development impacts and then provides suggestions to help realize those goals. So just to take one example, if the goal is to maximize development impacts by including them in project design and planning, then climate finance stakeholders should support the design of interventions that maximize development impacts. And one way to do this is through creating standardized impact pathways by sector that identify priority development impacts and metrics. To take one more example from the bottom of this slide, if stakeholders wish to maximize development impacts by improving the assessment and measurement of DIs, and to gain deeper insight into development impacts results that are difficult to measure or can't be measured, they could deploy more sophisticated tools such as modeling, especially for large projects that have the significant potential to generate development impacts. And in the full report, we provide additional recommendations to help strengthen development impacts and to strengthen the link between climate finance and DIs. And so this concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and question and answer session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And with that, I'm going to pass over to our moderator, Nicole, for the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Neha. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Great. Great. Well, I'm excited to bring in the panel now. Thanks, Daniel, for that amazing overview of the research. And I really do encourage everyone to take a quick scan of the summary brief to get a sense of the contents of this evaluation, and it will give you an idea of which areas of the evaluation you might like to take a closer look at. And one important component of the evaluation, as Daniel mentioned, was the case studies. And we have, as Neha introduced, a couple of representatives from partners who really know the projects quite well that were contained in the case studies. And we wanted to talk to them to get their feedback on, you know, how development impacts were a component of the projects from the beginning and what lessons learned they have from their project and also as it relates to the research. So I think I'll kick off with Clarice, if that's okay. And Clarice, we know the evaluation looked at 2 case studies in Brazil, which is where you're working with the ministry. And these case studies were focused on low carbon agriculture and forestry value chain development. Now, from looking at the research and also from your feedback, we understand that there were some specific design aspects of these projects that were focused on both the climate outcomes and the development impact outcomes. So based on your experience with these 2 SIF projects, as well as you're working on many land and forestry management projects in Brazil, what could you say about how you guys approach or the importance of designing the projects for development impacts at an upfront stage?
Hi, good morning all. Thank you, Nicole, for the question. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you
Okay,
well.
great. So Nicole, I would like to bring small pieces that brought together this program in Brazil. So I would start with the design of the coordination of the project, bringing together different areas from the government, including also civil society and private sector, it enabled the activities actually to be put in place. So I think the area of actors involved was very important for these projects to be successful in the field. So I would start with the design of the public policy. So all the projects in the FIP agenda in Brazil, they are under the umbrella of the plan for fighting deforestation for Cerrado. So all of them connects climate change, environmental conservation, forest conservation, and development. So we have one project that goes on the one side with the civil society and the indigenous people and community people living in local communities, living in the field, living in the bioma, which support the production and the conservation of specific products from Cerrado and allow the conservation of these areas. And on the other hand, private sector that produce this specific products from Cerrado and allows them to get the tunnel to the economy and bringing value to Cerrado. So this also helps in fighting deforestation and reducing the emissions, since we're giving value for the forest and for the biome as they are up in functioning perfectly. And not only, we have to remember that Cerrado is in Brazil, the area we have the large areas of agriculture and cattle raising. So once you give value for other products that do not demand deforestation in the area, bringing together with financial incentives and capacitation for production, this will allow to give another view for the biome itself. So I think the umbrella of having it under a public policy that goes together with the monitoring of emissions, bringing different aspects for financial support, and bringing value for this new characterization of agriculture in the low carbon production, allowed us to move from a threshold that is the business as usual production, and to give value for those who are conserving forest and are reducing emissions in the field. So I think in the context of, despite being categorized as an environmental plan, this planned for fighting deforestation in the Cerrado bring together in Brazil around 19 different ministries. So you have finance ministry, you have agriculture, you have science and technology, and you have the pool for public policy bringing together value for these discussions. So gender balance, participation, social participation, bringing together indigenous people, bringing the private sector, and giving a different view for production, which establish value for low carbon production, for local production, and for the use of the natural products from the Cerrado. That gave us and allowed us to move in further steps in the development of this area. Because we have a lot of information and a lot of projects going straight to the Amazon biome, but we have the frontier, the agriculture frontier, being held by Cerrado. So the project and defining this area as a priority to work brought us the support to avoid the advance into the Amazon Cerrado, and also bringing value for the areas, for the bioma area, and establishing a new type of production. So the low carbon production, the agriculture, was a step together with all the ministries we had in the FIP wallet, the Science and Technology Ministry, establishing the threshold of emissions in Cerrado, which gave us the subsidize us in the discussion of bringing policy, of understanding the deforestation procedures and the emission risks in this area, and allow us to bring together, for example, RED+ discussions within this project, the FIP wallet as a whole, and brought us different supports in these discussions. So I would say that having it under a public policy pool that brought together all the discussion of the biomes, bring together.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like at a design stage, some of the key points were around making sure you had all of the relevant ministries, not just on climate and environment, but also the ones who are sort of more tasked with livelihoods and agriculture and production aspects, so that you could kind of get everyone on the same page regarding all of the different outcomes that you wanted. I think there's probably some lessons learned there as well that we should come back to when we talk about recommendations, which I'd like to ask you about. So I'll come back to that.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks very much. I also wanted to bring in Shubhra to just discuss a little. So Daniel introduced us to the Bangladesh case study on coastal embankment projects. So we have an introduction of that, and Shubhra is online, right? I don't see him, so that's why I'm just checking. Okay, I can't see your picture. And so this project was really, or it was a couple of projects focusing on increased revenues in agriculture, improved cropping intensity, farmland protection, amongst other development impacts. And we understood, from the case study and from the research that when we look at impact pathways, they can be quite long. So you may do an intervention in something like a coastal embankment, which is really infrastructure, but there are expected impacts on farmland, and then as a result into the family or communities. And I was wondering if you could talk to us about which kind of development impacts the project actually planned for and tracked, and then which additional ones might have been brought in at the evaluation stage that you consider important and could be important to consider including in future follow-on projects.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, we hear you well.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak at this event. And first and foremost, I would like to extend my congratulations to the Climate Investment Fund team for their outstanding work in producing this comprehensive report on linking climate finance and development impacts. So in the context of Bangladesh, the study holds particular significance. As you may know, Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to the adverse effects of climate change. And therefore, the coastal embankment improvement projects is not only essential for the climate change adaptation and disaster management, but also for the socioeconomic development of the climate vulnerable areas of Bangladesh, specifically the coastal borders. So in response to the question you posed earlier, I would like to share it with you that 3 indicators that the project tracks at the project development objective level. Firstly, the project measures the gross area protected. This indicator is calculated as the summation of the total polder area multiplied by the ratio of the completed length of the embankment and the end target of the embankment for the 10 polders which are part of this project. The second development indicator that being tracked is the number of direct project beneficiaries from the increased resilience to climate change. This is determined by the summation of the total polder population and multiplied by the ratio of the completed length of embankment and the end target of the embankment for the 10 selected polders. Lastly, the project tracks on the increase in cropping intensity. This is measured as the total gross cropped area, which includes single, double, or triple crops, divided by the total cultivable land in a cropping season for the selected 10 polders of coastal embankment improvement project. So while the coastal embankment improvement project has made significant strides in checking the indicators that I just mentioned, it is important to recognize that there are a lot of other key development impacts not directly tracked under CIP. And Daniel, in his presentation, briefly discussed about this. So the report that we are discussing today has provided us with a valuable quantitative assessment of this and also qualitative assessment of some additional development impacts, which include such as increased agricultural revenues, job creation, and diversification to profitable crops. For example, though increased cropping intensity demonstrates the gross cropping area that has expanded, it does not reveal the specific ways in which the project has impacted the lives and livelihoods of the local population. On the other hand, the increase in agricultural revenue clearly illustrates the positive impact of the project, which can be directly attributed to the increase in cropping intensity. Furthermore, it is also important to recognize the distributional impact of the increased cropping intensity. This project benefits not only the landowners, but also others within the polder area through job creation. The case study presented in this report highlights that 45% of the direct jobs created by the projects went to women directly to the women, showcasing the project potential to uplift and empower women within these communities. Another noteworthy aspect of the report is the emphasis on crop diversification, which was supported by this project. So diversification to more profitable crops like watermelon plays a very crucial role in enhancing the economic well-being of the community and building resilience to the impacts of climate change. Responding to the comments that Daniel also briefly discussed in his presentation, as we learn from the coastal embankment improvement project experience, it is essential to adapt our approach and incorporate this learning into our future initiative. For example, the case study, the discussion, there was a discussion or assessment of the general mobility that Daniel also highlighted, that with embankment being used as roads. This has provided safe access to markets, schools, and healthcare facilities in the climate vulnerable areas where accessibility has always been a very challenging thing. Although this development impact is not captured in the current result framework, it is a valuable lesson to consider when designing and implementing future projects. So to conclude my discussion, to ensure that the future projects and investment on coastal resilience are comprehensive and effective, it is crucial to include this development impact as potential indicator in the result framework. By doing so, we can better track and evaluate the success of our projects and ensure that they address the needs of the communities most affected by climate change. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Shubhra. That's super helpful. And just even your last comment there around how there was mobility impacts of the project. I doubt that anyone thought that or really considered upfront how an investment in coastal embankment would also increase access to people, you know, to schools or to healthcare, you know, this is what we mean when we say there's a really long impact pathway, and how can we get as far down as possible in terms of really showing the impacts that what seems to be like a very narrow sectoral investment in agriculture, but then has all of these, you know, other additional impacts. So that's really, really very valuable insights, and excited to see how that gets incorporated into the next phases of these and other projects. So panelists, you're still on call because we are going to have questions from the audience in a second, but I wanted to turn to Helena, if I could. And Helena, the evaluation also included a case focused on sustainable forestry in Indonesia, which is, I know, where you're working, and the goals there were to reduce deforestation and degradation, but also to improve local capacity and livelihood. So there were these kind of dual goals of the project. And we saw from Daniel's presentation that inclusion of traditionally excluded groups can serve as one of the SuperDIs. So I was curious, from your experience in this sustainable forestry management project and others in Indonesia, how did this focus on inclusion, and you can talk more about what that was, what were the benefits of that to the project, and what were the benefits to the groups and the communities of this focus on inclusion? Do we have Helena on the line?
Yes.
Hi,
Hello,
Helena.
everyone.
Hello.
Hi, thank you. And I should say this is also thanks for this very elaborate study for the development impacts. I think it's a good opportunity for Indonesia to have sustainable forest management projects for the SIF fund, and then inclusion of the women and indigenous people also very good lesson learned from the project. I should say the benefit for the inclusion of women and indigenous groups, and also including the youth at the end, has increased the impact and sustainability of the project. More economic benefits such as job creation and increase of the livelihood. Women, indigenous group, and youth involvement will also help to increase the project sustainability towards the end of the project. Yeah, it's become more visible that the sustainability is being supported by the involvement of this group, because they can influence, they can play as a forest guardian, and they are expected also to pass their knowledge to the next generation. So in the beginning, actually, the project faced some cultural challenge, yeah, to involve women, mostly in the remote areas. So the project is trying to find a practical solution, mostly just as much as possible to include them in the project activities. First, I think they try to ask the local leaders of the women, like the government staff in the district, and also the forest management units, to set an example, to set a model, so then it is easier to involve the community after they ask the community leader to join. And also I should say it's supported by the government effort as well, because the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, as the executing agency of the project, has now regularly award and give reward, not financial reward, but it's just a reward to recognize the project and the staff that is active and makes it significant effort to increase the participation of women and the indigenous group. So I think it's
you did mention,
good,
I remember you did mention that there was also a focus on youth and young women, and maybe you could talk about that and why that was strategic to sort of ensure the success of the project.
Yes, actually it's not very carefully planned, yeah, I should say, in the beginning, because we face some challenge in the startup of the project, and then all the facilitator, and then the project personnel in the field thinks that they have to adjust the timing of the project activities with the women activities in the remote area. Usually women is busy in the morning with the kids and children, so and then cooking as well. So they try to adjust the timing, and then they find out later that there are many teenager or young the girls that cannot go to the university in the remote area, so they are become the also the target of the project, because they don't have they are not married yet, so they will be a good target, and they have time to join the project activities. I think that's what I can say about this project.
That's
Thank you.
super interesting as a way that the project sort of pivoted to take advantage of like an opportunity. And then maybe just really briefly, like, what did you see as the impacts on the communities and the groups that were purposely included? So, you know, there was indigenous communities, there was women, young women or youth. Can you talk just a little bit about what were the impacts that you saw on them? So there was impacts to the project itself in terms of its sustainability and uptake in the community, but what about on the participants?
What we can clearly, I also sometimes when I went to the field, I check and interview some of the women, and they said that it was a pride that they have some money by themselves, so that because they supported the livelihood of the husband and the family, so it's maybe the first time that they can earn their own money, and it brings them kind of pride and then confident in doing everything, actually in doing their activities, and it can also later we bring that confidence and then the feeling that they can do something in the community to protect the forest, and then to see that their livelihood actually is based on the forest resources, that so then they have to protect the forest as well, so that we can bring that to the to our core objective of the project.
That's great. That's really, really interesting. And the case study highlights it, of course, but it's just nice to hear it also from your personal experience of what you saw. So thanks, Helena. I'm gonna turn to another question now, but please stay on the line because we do have questions from the audience, and we're going to take those questions live as well. So I wanted to just a quick follow-up question to Daniel before I come to Neha. I had a question for you as well, but Daniel, you did share an example in your presentation from the evaluation that focused on utility scale renewable energy, specifically geothermal energy in Indonesia. And, you know, you showed how some modeling was used to show that there's a lot of follow-on economy-wide impacts of increased power capacity that goes beyond just the additional power, but there's impact channels such as like increased electrification and all of the economic benefits of that, also from increased education and labor productivity, and also from reduced air pollution. So there's all these potential channels of impacts, but they're not really measurable. It really requires a little bit more intensive modeling. So I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of participants who may be working on renewable energy projects themselves, current or planned, and how could they take advantage of these lessons learned that economy-wide impacts of investments in power capacity are really important. And we need to do our best to try to capture those more broadly to really show the complete full scope of impacts that we're having beyond just the power impacts.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So one thing that really stood out for us when we did that more intensive modeling for the Indonesia geothermal case study was the relative contribution of each impacts channel. So you mentioned increased electrification, increased labor productivity, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and improved health. Far and away, increased electrification was the largest impact channel. And we saw that that's associated with projects that bring electricity to areas that have not previously had electricity, or where the electricity supply has not been reliable. Mm-hmm. And that was by far the biggest driver of the overall results that we found from our economy-wide analysis through the CGE modeling. And so one lesson for project design is to really focus on these remote, underserved areas that don't currently have access to electricity. And that's one type of development impacts that may be overlooked if the focus is purely on power capacity developments, because developing power capacity could you could install the same capacity really anywhere in the country potentially, and in some ways it's probably easier to do so in parts of the country that are already electrified, that already have existing infrastructure in place, existing power lines, etc. But to maximize the development impacts from those power capacity development projects, thinking about the place where those projects are sited, particularly in areas that don't already have reliable electricity access, is really key to maximize those development impacts. I'll also just briefly mention qualitatively, we also saw additional examples of maximizing DIs from power capacity projects through intentional project design. So our colleagues at Trinomics organized a really extensive series of site visits to some of the areas that had that were developing geothermal projects under this case study. And part of what we found was that the ability of the local community and the local population to benefit from these projects, not just in terms of the electricity access, but also in terms of local jobs, social inclusion and empowerment around the projects, and increased income associated with the projects really depended on decisions that were made up front with the funders and the project developers about how the local community would be engaged. And so that was also another really important example of development impacts that we saw stemming from these projects that really requires that intentional design work up front. With these lessons or insights from the case study, it wouldn't necessarily be required for everyone to do the same type of modeling analysis for their projects, at least not in the beginning, that we did for this project. But to be able to keep these development impacts and pathways in mind when designing the projects can help to maximize those impacts later on.
That's super helpful. And you also circled back, thank you, to like what is essentially a SuperDI, which was the involvement of the community up front was going to then maximize the DI. So it wasn't just the modeling, it was, you know, the community influencing, you know, the siting and their involvement. So that's really interesting. Great. So Neha, just to wrap up with our panel, we did want to give a chance to talk about, you know, how does this relate to funders? So we're talking about climate finance. We're talking about people who would like to finance or fund in different ways climate activities. And based on the evaluation, based on everything we've seen from Daniel and his team, what would you say are like the top 3 ways that you would recommend that other climate funders, you know, like the SIF, but others as well, can support improved planning for development impacts along with climate goals for existing or future projects or programs?
Thanks, Nicole. And I'll be repeating some of what my colleagues have already brought more grounded experience and findings on. So just hearing from Helena, Shuvra, and Clarice was quite interesting to see that how they're reflecting on the findings from this evaluation. So I might be repeating on what Daniel has said and what they've shared, but I think this lesson on planning early really takes home some of the main ways in which a lot of the development impacts that the evaluation looked at were realized. So planning early, the evaluation
Or not realized, like in the case of not planned for.
Exactly. And so, you know, development impacts can be understood up front. They can be made part of the theory of change. So for example, from the SIP side, in the integrated results frameworks for our new SIP programs, we're putting co-benefits and development impacts as part of things that need to be tracked, that need to be planned for and tracked. So that's sort of upfront planning that can help realize these impacts in the future, and what the upfront work involved with achieving that. And then the modeling work and how a lot of ex-ante modeling work can be done to evaluate potential ways forward, to see how these impacts may have been realized in other places or could be, and how do you estimate that through some of the modeling efforts. And I'd say, the third part with the upfront planning is to recognize the barriers and challenges, whether they be technical or governance related or capacity related, but trying to predict these through evidence from cases in the past and trying to address them upfront. So that upfront planning, I think, is a big one, big takeaway. The second one is really the SuperDIs, or the catalytic DIs that we've spoken quite a bit about, the gender and social inclusion, capacity development, the focus on local workforce development, these type of things that in the SIP we've learned, not just through this evaluation, but a lot of the other work that we've done, that technical assistance when clubbed with concessional funds goes a really long way. And how do you use that technical assistance and grants upfront on some of these SuperDIs, on some of these ways in which other DIs can then be realized along that impact pathway. So I'd say that's definitely a core takeaway from this evaluation. And then lastly, from my point of view, from the work that we do at the SIP on evaluations and learning and knowledge, that's supporting the partnership and supporting the peer-to-peer learning, and creating the strong knowledge base that's required for some of this work. This needs financing too, and it's a worthwhile investment to make in that strong knowledge base and partnerships and collaboration upfront on subjects such as development impacts. So I'd say those were the three, but again, I know I've repeated some of the things that were said before, but
No, we need to
definitely
have
lessons.
them reminded because we're still learning, still taking stock. So that's very helpful. And other funders if we do have other funders on the call, we're interested to hear your takeaways as well, because we are going to move to audience Q&A now. So I did want to open up the floor. So we do have some questions that have come in the chat, but I wanted to check. Well, I guess if you did have a question you'd like to, share live, we can also you can unmute and you can share your question. But in the meantime, I'll just quickly start with some of the questions that have come in, I think. So these are a little bit for Daniel, I believe. So maybe if you could just speak briefly, Daniel, to two aspects of the research. So one is sort of a technical question on how do development impacts and pathways relate to theories of change or results chains? Are they the same, or is there any differences? And then there was also sort of a technical question around whether the research looked at hidden or negative consequences of projects, which there is a section on unintended impacts. And if you could just speak quickly to that, direct the participant to that part of the research.
Sure. So I guess taking the second question first, we did look at unintended or negative consequences, and there is a section in our report on that. The unintended consequences or negative consequences, I guess you could say that that we observed were related to issues around land use and project siting. And in those cases, these issues were foreseen by the projects, and the projects tried to take steps to provide relocation assistance to residents, and the relocation was expected to be temporary. Having said that, due to the COVID situation that was on the grounds, and that was going on when we were conducting most of the research for this project, we weren't actually able to conduct as much extensive field work as we had initially planned to do. So we weren't able to talk as extensively with the local populations that might have been affected by these projects. But that is one issue that we talk about somewhat in our reports. We also, one area that would actually be good to study further, and that I think gets to your question, is distributional impacts. So we looked a lot at social inclusion and gender inclusion, but taking a deeper dive on the distributional and equity components of the project, seeing who benefits and perhaps who doesn't benefit from the projects would, I think, be a good next step for development impacts research. We did see some examples of local content requirements, just looking at the question in the chat about requirements to purchase different types of products. There were some really good examples of local content requirements or local content targets, which is sort of the opposite, I think, of the negative impacts that's being referred to in the question. But to kind of flip it around on the positive side, where we did see those local content requirements, that certainly, as expected, corresponds to greater inclusion and greater economic benefit for the local population. Thinking about the other question, the theory of change and how does that relate to the development impacts pathways? At a high level, I would say it follows a similar logic in that we're looking at what objectives we want to achieve or the project or investment wants to achieve, and then kind of plotting that logical chain from project activities and asking, how do you get from here to there? How do you get from what the project is doing to the ultimate results that the project is aiming to achieve? But we look at it specifically through the lens of development impacts. So instead of focusing on activities, outputs, audiences affected, changes in awareness, changes in behavior, changes in conditions, sort of through a typical, logic modeling framework, at every level, we're looking at development impacts. So we're asking, what are the first order or sort of initial development impacts? Then what can result in turn from those development impacts? And that's where we get to some of these catalytic or SuperDIs. And then ultimately, what does this lead to either on a larger scale or for a community as a whole? So similar logic, but a slightly different framing or lens than we would typically take in a theory of change approach. So I hope that helps answer the question.
That does helpful. That's very helpful. Thanks. So I wanted to check with the audience again. Do we have questions, Brittany? Are people able to speak on the call? Are they able to indicate in some way if they have a question?
Yes, you please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or just put them in the chat.
So we do have a question I see from George. If we could expand on what capacity building involves as a development impact in the analysis, what institutions, individuals are having capacity raised or built, and through what techniques. Okay, so this is pretty broad, but this is an important one. This was, George, in the evaluation, this was actually a cross-cutting development impact, meaning that we felt that it cut across all four areas, all four types of impacts: social, economic, environmental, and market. So Daniel, do you want to just maybe give a brief overview of what types of capacity building we saw?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say as a sort of as an overview, it really depends on the situation, and where capacity building was found to be effective. It was effective because it targeted, just as this question asked, it diagnosed and figured out the answers to that question in each particular situation. Whose capacity needs to be developed, and what are the most effective ways to develop that capacity? In some cases, it's governments, the government's ability to develop and use data and analytics for natural resource planning or management decisions. We saw that was one of the benefits from the Bangladesh coastal embankments case study. In other cases, it's government's capacity to create a more conducive policy environment, an enabling environment for legislation or laws that are or policies that are required for certain types of projects to move forward. In many cases, it's the capacity of communities to participate in the projects that are geographically located with them, to be able to provide marketable skills and services for those projects. In other cases, it's the capacity of financial institutions to evaluate new types of technologies or to test new financing structures that are perceived to be risky or that aren't well understood, and to become comfortable with those types of arrangements. So kind of, if you can think of a type of stakeholder that would be involved in a project, chances are they showed up in at least one of the case studies as a group that was having their capacity built. And sort of how that was done, it includes direct technical assistance, oftentimes, as Neha alluded to before in one of her responses in the chat, technical assistance paired with financing was a very powerful approach. At other times, it was training. So again, it sort of depends on the situation, what tool was used to build stakeholder capacity.
Thanks. And I just wanted to open for our panelists, if you have any examples of capacity building that was done in your program that you want to share, just let me know. We could bring that through as well. And in the meantime, I'll just also ask just the group as well, if any participants here have programs that you are working on today where you're trying to maximize development impacts. If you don't have a question, but you just want to share what you're doing or what you've learned, we're excited to hear about that as well. So please just send us a smoke signal and we can bring you into the conversation. But Shubhra, did you have a comment on the capacity building?
So just to quickly add on the capacity building part. So in Coastal American Improvement Project, the project established and empowered local water management communities called water management organizations. These are established at the field level, specifically targeting hydrological boundaries, and it had a mandate to include at least 30% women at the leadership position. So that shows the level of commitment from the government also in terms of endorsing this at the local government level. So as also reflected in this report, I think almost more than 25,000 women are members in these water management groups, which are like 36% of the total memberships. This shows how these women have been trained in terms of operating these hydraulic structures and also do small operational maintenance works in terms of maintaining these embankments. So just to add on this.
That's great. That's a great example. And I was just reminded when you mentioned that also there, you may want to take a look at the Niger case study as well, just for anyone interested in capacity building, because that did have a focus on increasing community capacity on climate resilience in agriculture through the establishment of maisons de paysans or farmers' houses. So that might be a good one to look at as well. And I think we have a hand up from Nakisha. I'm not sure if we can. I don't know if I have the power to give you the floor, or if someone else could give Nakisha the floor. Maybe you, Brittany, are you allowed?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Hear you well, Nakisha, thank you.
Hey, I thought this was very interesting. I am not familiar, if I can be really honest, on the background of what's happening, but I wanted to listen in based on the work that I've been doing. And I just wanted to share when we were talking about, I'm really good at being able to get community, to kind of like participate in a lot of different things that I feel like I do in institution, if that makes sense. And I'm saying it to say that I'm currently in Ghana, and some of the work that I've been doing here, it's been definitely about trust, right? And so when I'm listening in and hearing us speak about development and different things like that, listening from some stories that I've heard, some of the things that people were doing, like before we developed them in these other ways, right, were very good for our climate, right? And it seems like when I say we, I think about us who don't live in certain places, who come to certain places and try to develop, that's what I'm thinking about. So I feel like, because I'm not versed with words like the, climate word genre. So I'm trying to talk to y'all in a way that y'all understand, because I don't know all the words. But I will say that tapping into the wisdom of the people who live in these places and trying to figure out some of the things that they were doing before our climate tipped in a different area is really some work that I would like to see funded. I'm doing it out of my own pocket, and I'm seeing lots of communities build soil and all these awesome things by just tapping back into their cultural things. And so I don't see a lot of funding, right, for or support for those type of initiatives. And I wanted to know if those were things, because those were, they would be things that I would like to see happen or even support, because I kind of travel the world and can have that good relationship, but I listen to people and hear about what they were doing before other people stepped on the scene. You know what I mean?
Thank you, Nikisha. That's really interesting. And actually, there is a specific mechanism at the SIF. I'm not sure if Neha, you'd like to just quickly mention the funding sources that are specifically for Indigenous communities, although it can be considered in other programs as well. But did you want to say something about that?
The dedicated grant mechanism, is that?
Yeah.
And Nikisha, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing up such an important point. We recognize that a lot of sustainable development work is happening that may not be called sustainable development work or associated with climate finance. Nevertheless, it is happening, and it's happening by local communities and Indigenous peoples who are closer to the lands and are doing a great job of governing that land. And we need to provide projects such as the ones that you're describing, more finance. So the Climate Investment Funds has a mechanism of providing direct access to Indigenous peoples and local communities. We call it the dedicated grant mechanism. It operates under our forestry portfolio. And within it, we're able to provide small grants to the type of work that you're describing. The DGM is currently functioning in about 14 countries, but we have a new program that we've launched on nature, people, and climate that's focused on nature-based solutions. And we're now duplicating the model of that direct grant mechanism into our new program. So if you know, I'll share my email. Please share the details of the work that you're doing and the projects that you're a part of, and we'll get it to the program lead, and maybe they'll want to talk to you about the work that you're doing. But thank you for bringing up this very important point. And there's I know that the terminology might be different, but the objectives are similar.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a great reminder. And actually, the SIF recently hosted an event in West Africa, Nikisha, in Abidjan, to focus on sharing a lot of the lessons learned. And there was a great participation from Indigenous groups there. So you can see some of the summaries of those discussions, but it was very, very good to see that level of engagement. And we have like a related question coming in. So on how important it is that the projects are led by local communities for the success. So here, I think this also came out in the research. So Daniel or Helena or anyone else on the panel who wants to comment, but there was a recommendation around, not just seeing local communities as a stakeholder group, but also seeing them as a group that is needed to actually help in the design and, thinking through what is the strategy and objectives. So as opposed to being consulted afterwards, being part of the driving force behind what the decision making is. So that did come through strongly. But Daniel or Helena or anyone, would you like to give a comment or example of what was really meant by that recommendation, maybe, or what you've seen in your experience?
Well, I can comment on what was meant by that recommendation.
Yeah.
Really to put the community in the driver's seat and to, give the community a real real ownership of the project, because it's something that the community cares about and sees as addressing their needs and priorities. as you said, Nicole, going beyond the consultation to an actual community-driven project. I think in the evaluation, probably sort of the clearest examples that we saw of that were from DGM funded projects, which we didn't look at extensively. We did look at some of the DGM funded projects as part of one of the Brazil case studies.
Okay.
But I saw Helena come on camera, and I would love to hear any examples or insights that you have on that.
Absolutely, Helena.
Yeah, I think one example like what we did in the project is ask the community group, the farmer in nearby the forest area for what type of trees that they would like to plant. So it's the project also targeted to have agroforestry hectares. Yeah, so we have target on that, and then before we design on the project is designing on the the agroforestry component. First, we ask the community on the type of the trees, and then we also the project also actually create a contract. Yeah, so it's not really just to engage the community, but it's really kind of we make a contractual agreement, and then so then they feel like the responsibility is more, and the ownership as well. So we try to make more meaningful, and then move beyond the meaningful, going to the legal aspect of the agreement. What does it mean, like, to have agreement and contract with the community to maintain their agroforestry location example. So that's the example that I can give from the project.
That's super useful. Thank you so much, Helena. I realize that we're at the end of our time, and we did want to do a quick wrap up just to tell you what's next in this research. So we're not ending here. There's a lot more to come, and thank you again for to our panelists and for all the Q&A. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany. I think you're going to just walk us through next steps and the development impacts activities of the SIP.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to all of the panelists for the interesting discussion and all of the questions. It's been great to see how our lessons from the evaluation can be taken forward. And in line with that, we're just, I'm going to share a few of our next steps. One is that we will be having a development impacts planning workshop within the next couple of months. So also, if you would like to be involved in that, please also share your emails in the chat, and I'll make note of that. It will be an interactive session where we go through building development impact pathways. And then we also have a development impacts workbook that we're planning to launch, and that will provide practical guidance how to better use and interpret the development impacts planning and assessment tools for your projects. And we will also be launching fact sheets that will provide insights specific to each major development impact category. So market development, social, economic, and environmental. Yes, so please, yeah, we will send an email with all of these details, but thank you all so much for joining, and I know we're out of time. So please keep in touch, and we look forward to taking this work forward. Thank you all.